In the middle of the crowded airport, a little girl stared at a handsome man and cried out, "Daddy, why did you abandon us?" The millionaire froze, and everyone around stopped to hear what he would say. Emily held her mother's hand tightly as they moved through the busy airport. Her eyes were wide, scanning the area. She could barely keep up with her mom's long strides. People rushed past them in every direction. Families, business travelers, all with determined expressions. The air was filled with announcements, suitcase wheels clattering, and hurried conversations. Emily's heart pounded in her small chest. Today was the day, and she felt every kind of emotion she knew: excitement, hope, and mostly fear. "Do you think he's here, Mom?" Emily asked, almost whispering. Her mom didn't answer right away. Her face was tense, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "He has to be," she finally said. Her eyes were searching just as much as Emily's, darting from one face to the next. Emily felt out of place in her simple clothes. She hugged her small pink backpack closer, almost like a shield. Around her, people wore suits, elegant dresses, and their luggage was sleek and shiny. Everything here seemed polished, too bright. It wasn't like home. Her mom wore her best dress, but even then, they looked different. She wasn't used to places like this. Suddenly, her mom stopped walking. Emily bumped slightly into her, looking up in confusion. Her mom's eyes were fixed on someone across the way. She leaned down, her voice low and almost shaky. "That's him, Emily. That's your father." Emily turned, following her mom's gaze. A man stood near the gate, looking at his phone, his coat impeccably tailored, shoes shining. His hair was dark, neatly styled, and his face was stern, focused on whatever was on his screen. He seemed so distant, as if he belonged to another world. Emily swallowed hard. Her feet felt heavy, glued to the polished airport floor. She took a deep breath. She knew why they were here. This was her chance to finally get answered, to meet the person she'd imagined for so long. But seeing him made everything feel more real. She didn't know if she could do this. Her mom knelt beside her, putting a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You have to be brave, sweetie. Just go over there and talk to him. I'll be right behind you." Emily looked at her mom, then back at the man. She could feel her heart beating faster. She nodded, more to herself than to her mom. She had questions, and this was the only way to get answers. She had to do it for herself. Slowly, she let go of her mom's hand and took a step forward, then another. She walked, her little pink backpack bouncing slightly on her shoulders. The people around her seemed like a blur, her eyes locked on that one figure across the way. She could see the shine of his shoes, his tall posture, his back turned to her. She was close now, close enough that she could almost reach out and touch him. Her small voice echoed in the busy airport. "Daddy?" The man turned, his eyes narrowing in confusion as he looked down at her. There was a moment of silence. Emily felt like the whole world had stopped. She took a breath, her voice trembling but louder now. "Why did you leave us?" The airport seemed to pause. Conversations died out. People turned to look. Emily could feel dozens of eyes on her, but she didn't care. All she could see was his face, the confusion, the shock. He blinked, his mouth opening slightly, as if trying to form words, but nothing came out. He looked at her, then around, his eyes wide. He saw her mother a few steps behind, her face unreadable. The realization seemed to hit him, his shoulders tensing up, his eyes returning to Emily. The words seemed to take a moment before they finally left his lips. I don't know who you are." Emily swallowed, feeling a knot form in her stomach. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but nothing had prepared her for those words. She looked up at him, her small voice almost cracking. "You're my dad. You're John, right? You left me and Mom. You never came back." John glanced around, his face flushed now, not with embarrassment but with something deeper. His hand moved awkwardly to adjust his tie. He looked at Emily, then at her mother again, who hadn't moved. The people around them were still staring, waiting to see what would happen. "Look, kid, he started, but his voice faltered. He cleared his throat, taking a step back. "What do you want? Money?" He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet. Emily shook her head, tears starting to well up. "I don't want money. I want to know why. Why you left us. Why you never came back." John looked at her, then at the people watching, and then back at her mother, who finally stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. Her voice was low, almost a growl. "Put your wallet away, John. She doesn't want that." Emily could see something change in his face, a moment of recognition. He blinked, closing his wallet, his hands trembling slightly. He seemed to lose some of his composure, his eyes meeting Emily's again. "Listen, I can't do this here," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "This isn't the right place." Emily bit her lip. "Then why didn't you come before? Why now?" He didn't have an answer. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, his eyes moving across her face, seeing the small features that mirrored his own. He took a deep breath, looking almost desperate. "I don't know." Suddenly, 2 security guards appeared. They looked at Emily, then at John. "Is everything all right here?" one of them asked, his hand resting on his radio. John glanced at the guard, then back at Emily. He swallowed. Yes, it's fine. She's my daughter," he said, the words sounding strange even to himself. He looked at Emily, his eyes softening, his voice almost breaking. "She's my daughter." The guard nodded, stepping back, but Emily could still feel the eyes of everyone around them. John looked at her again, then at her mother. He seemed to be searching for something, some kind of answer that wasn't there. He finally sighed. Let's go somewhere else, somewhere quieter," he said. He gestured towards a seating area, away from the gate, where it was less crowded. Emily looked back at her mom, who gave her a small nod. Emily turned back to John, and nodded too. They began to move, the crowd slowly returning to their own lives, the noise of the airport picking back up as if nothing had happened. But for Emily, everything had changed. She had spoken to her father, and now, maybe, just maybe, she would get some answers. They moved away from the busy gate area, towards a row of chairs next to the large glass windows overlooking the runway. Emily followed her father, her mother right beside her. There was a tension between them, a silence that felt like it could snap at any moment. John seemed lost in his own thoughts, his eyes shifting between Emily and her mother. He finally stopped near the chairs and gestured for them to sit. Emily sat down first, her mother right next to her. John stayed standing for a moment, his hands resting on his hips, as if unsure what to do. He looked at Emily again, taking in her small frame, her hair that fell loosely over her shoulders. It was strange to him, the feeling of seeing his own features in her. It was something he didn't expect, something he wasn't prepared for. "So, what exactly do you want from me?" he finally asked, his voice a little too sharp. Emily's mother shot him a glare. "John, she doesn't want anything from you. She just wants answers. Stop talking like it's about money." Emily looked at her feet, her hands fidgeting on her lap. She looked up at her father, her eyes wide. "I just want to know why you left, why you never came back. Mom always says it was complicated, but I don't understand. I want to know why." John exhaled, rubbing his temple. He glanced at Emily's mother, who stared back at him, her expression hard. He knew this was his doing, his mess, but facing it, seeing it through Emily's eyes, was harder than he imagined. "Look, I had to leave. Things weren't working out between me and your mom," John said, his voice more guarded. He looked at Emily, trying to explain. "I thought it was for the best. I didn't think I could be a good father." Emily's brow furrowed. "But you never even tried. You just left us." Her voice wavered, and she quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. John took a deep breath. I know it sounds terrible, and maybe it was, but I wasn't ready, Emily. I was scared, okay?" He looked at her mother for a moment, as if hoping she might back him up, but she didn't. "You think being scared is a reason?" Emily's mother said, her voice cold. "You think that's an excuse for what you did?" John looked away, his jaw tightening. He could feel the judgment, not just from Emily's mother but from himself. He felt cornered, like there was no answer he could give that would make anything better. Emily spoke up, her voice small. "I didn't want anything big. I just wanted to meet you, to know why. Mom always tried to make it okay, but I always wondered." John looked back at Emily. He felt something inside him soften. He could see how much this meant to her, how much she had carried all this time. He swallowed, trying to find words that made sense. "I wish I could tell you that I had a good reason, Emily, but I don't," he said finally, his voice quieter. "I was selfish. I thought I was doing the right thing for me, and I didn't think about what it would do to you or your mom. I made mistakes." Emily nodded slowly. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to understand. "Are you still scared?" she asked. John blinked, caught off guard by her question. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized he didn't have an easy answer. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Yeah, I guess I am. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be what you need me to be." Emily looked at her mother, then back at John. "I just want you to try," she said simply. John took another breath, then slowly sat down in the chair across from them. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He nodded. "Okay, I can try." There was a silence. Emily's mother seemed to soften a bit, her eyes glancing at John, then back at her daughter. The tension was still there, but something had shifted. It was like a door had opened, even if just a crack. "Okay then," Emily's mother said, her voice low. "What now?" John looked around, still feeling the awkwardness of being in such a public place for a moment like this. He glanced at the security guards, now far in the distance, back to their posts. He sighed and looked back at Emily. "Maybe we can sit somewhere quieter, talk a bit more." "If you want, Emily," he said. Emily looked up, her eyes hopeful. "Yeah, I'd like that." John gave a small nod. He turned to Emily's mother. "Do you know a place? Somewhere less busy?" Emily's mother studied him for a moment, then slowly nodded. "There's a small cafe on the other side of the terminal. It's quieter. We can go there." John stood up, smoothing his coat. He held out his hand towards Emily. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took it. Her small hand in his felt fragile, but also strong in a way he didn't expect. He helped her up, and they began walking, her mother following close behind. They moved through the terminal, past the crowds, the noise. Emily held her father's hand, her eyes glancing up at him every now and then, as if trying to understand who he was, what kind of man he could be. John looked straight ahead, trying to ignore the stares they got as they walked together. Finally, they reached the cafe. It was quieter, the chairs and tables mostly empty. John found a table in the corner, and they all sat down. Emily put her backpack on the floor beside her and looked at her father. He looked back at her, then at the menu. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to break the awkwardness. Emily shrugged. "I don't know. Hot chocolate? Maybe?" John signaled for a waiter. They ordered hot chocolate for Emily, coffee for the adults. Emily's mother sat quietly, watching John carefully, still not fully trusting this situation. John glanced at her, then back at Emily. "So, what do you do?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Emily smiled a little. "I draw. I like drawing, and I like reading too." John nodded, trying to picture it. He couldn't help but wonder about all the things he missed. Birthdays, first words, first day at school. He felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it away. He couldn't change the past. "I'd like to see some of your drawings," he said. Emily looked down, then nodded. "Maybe I can show you sometime." The drinks arrived, and they settled into a strange kind of quiet. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it felt less sharp. It was like they were all trying to find a new normal, one small step at a time. John sipped his coffee and looked at his daughter. He didn't have the answers she wanted, and he didn't know if he ever would. But for now, he was here, and maybe that was enough. They sat there, drinks in front of them, a cautious silence hanging over the table. Emily held her hot chocolate in both hands, her eyes occasionally darting from her father to her mother. She didn't know how to start. There was so much she wanted to know, but she didn't know where to begin. Her mother glanced at John, her expression still guarded, but for Emily's sake, she stayed quiet. John cleared his throat, trying to think of something to say. He looked at Emily, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized cafe chair. "So, Emily, what else do you like to do besides drawing?" he asked. Emily looked up, a small smile playing at her lips. "I like reading too, and sometimes I help Mom in the kitchen. I like baking cookies, but drawing's my favorite." John nodded, feeling a strange pang in his chest. He imagined her at home, drawing, reading, baking cookies, normal things, things he had never been a part of. He felt the weight of what he'd missed, but pushed it aside. This wasn't about him. It was about her, about what she needed now. "You bake, huh? I was never very good at that," John said, trying to keep his tone light. He gave her a small smile. "Maybe you could show me sometime." Emily's eyes brightened just a little. "Really?" she asked, her voice hopeful. John nodded. "Sure, if you want. I'd love to try some of your cookies." Emily smiled, but the smile faded quickly. She looked at her mother, then back at John, as if she was still uncertain. Her mother met her gaze, then nodded, as if giving her permission. Emily took a breath. "Why didn't you answer the letters?" she asked. her voice barely a whisper. John froze for a moment. He looked at Emily, then at her mother, who was watching him with a hard stare. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, he said quietly. I guess I thought it was better if I stayed away. I was wrong. I know that now. Emily looked down at her drink. She traced her finger along the rim of her cup. We sent you pictures too, she said, her voice still soft. I drew a lot of pictures for you. John's throat tightened. He looked over at Emily's mother, who was now avoiding his gaze. I didn't know what to do with those. I didn't know if it mattered. Emily's mother finally spoke, her voice sharp. Of course it mattered. She needed you, John. She needed to know that you cared, that you were still there, even if just a little bit. John swallowed, his eyes dropping to the table. I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking slightly. He looked up at Emily. I'm really sorry, Emily. I can't take back what I did. I wish I could, but I can't. All I can do now is try to be here for you, if you'll let me. Emily nodded, her eyes still downcast. She wiped her eyes quickly with her sleeve, then looked up at him. I just want you to try, she repeated, her voice steady this time. I want you to try to be my dad. John nodded, his heart feeling heavier than ever. He had no idea how to be a father. He barely knew where to start, but he looked at Emily, at her hopeful eyes, and he knew he had to try. He owed her that much. Okay, he said, his voice stronger now. I'll try, I promise. Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a long moment. She nodded slowly, accepting his words. Her mother was silent, her face a mixture of emotions, anger, pain, but also, maybe, a hint of hope. John reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He looked at Emily. How about we exchange numbers? He asked. That way, you can call me or text me anytime, and I'll do the same. Emily looked at her mother, who nodded. Emily smiled and took her father's phone. She typed in her mother's number, then handed it back to him. John did the same with his phone, and Emily's mother typed in Emily's number. There, John said, looking at the screen. He looked at Emily. I'll call you, I promise. Emily nodded. Okay. She hesitated, then spoke again. Can we see you again? Soon? John looked at Emily's mother, who sighed but nodded. We can work something out, she said. She looked at John, her eyes narrowing slightly. But you need to show up. No excuses, no disappearing. She's been hurt enough. John nodded. I understand, he said, his voice sincere. I won't let you down. Emily looked at her mother, then back at John. I want you to come to our house, she said, to see where we live. John blinked, taken aback. He looked at Emily's mother, who seemed surprised too. She paused, then nodded slowly. If that's what Emily wants, then yes, you can come to our house. John swallowed hard. He hadn't expected that. He had imagined meeting in public places, somewhere safe and neutral, but going to their home, that felt real. It felt heavy. He nodded, his eyes locking with Emily's. Okay, he said. I'll come? Emily smiled, her eyes lighting up. Good, she said. We have a small apartment, but it's nice. Mom makes it nice. John gave her a small smile. I'm sure it's great, he said, and I'd love to see it. The waiter came over to clear their cups, and the moment broke. Emily's mother stood up, and John followed. Emily grabbed her pink backpack and slung it over her shoulders. John looked at her, then at her mother. Thank you for letting me talk to her, he said, his voice sincere. Emily's mother nodded. Just don't make me regret it, John, she said, her voice low. John nodded. He looked down at Emily, who was staring up at him. He gave her a small smile. I'll see you soon, okay? Emily smiled back. Okay, she said. John hesitated, then reached out and ruffled her hair gently. Emily giggled, her eyes brightening. John felt his heart swell, something he hadn't expected. He turned and walked away, his heart heavy but hopeful. Emily watched him go, her mother standing beside her. Her mother looked down at her, her voice softening. Are you okay, sweetheart? She asked. Emily nodded, her eyes still on John. Yeah, she said quietly. I think he's really going to try. Her mother sighed, her arm wrapping around Emily's shoulders. I hope so, she said, her voice full of mixed emotions. They watched as John disappeared into the crowd of the airport, his tall figure fading away. Emily turned to her mother, her eyes filled with a kind of cautious hope. She nodded, as if convincing herself. Let's go home, Mom, she said. Her mother nodded, and together, They walked towards the exit. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt a little lighter, like maybe things could change, like maybe her dad would be there, one small step at a time. They walked out of the airport and into the parking lot. Emily held her mother's hand tightly. The warmth of her mother's touch gave her some reassurance, but her mind was still buzzing. She kept replaying the conversation with her dad. It was real now. She'd spoken to him, and he promised to try. There were so many emotions mixed up in her chest, but one thing stood out more than the rest: hope. Maybe he would really come through this time. Her mother was quiet as they drove home. Emily looked out of the window, the city moving by in a blur of lights and people. She couldn't help but think about what it would be like to have her dad in her life, to have him come over, see her room, maybe even help with her drawings. She knew things couldn't be perfect, but she hoped they could at least be better. The drive wasn't long, and soon they were pulling into the small parking lot by their apartment building. Emily hopped out, her small pink backpack bouncing as she ran up the stairs. Her mother followed behind, unlocking the door and letting them inside. "Emily, sweetie, why don't you get ready for bed? It's been a long day," her mother said, her voice gentle. Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of excitement. She went to her room, changed into her pajamas, and brushed her teeth quickly. She came back out, her eyes wide, still full of questions. "Mom, do you think Dad will really come?" she asked, her voice soft. Her mother looked at her, then sat down on the couch, patting the spot next to her. Emily climbed up, sitting close. Her mother put an arm around her shoulders. "I don't know, Emily. I want to believe him," she said, her voice tired. "But he's hurt us before. I just don't want you to get your hopes up too much, okay? It's better if we're careful." Emily nodded, though she didn't like the idea of being careful. She wanted to believe her dad. He had looked at her differently today, and it made her think maybe things could change. "But he said he would try, right?" Emily insisted, her eyes wide. Her mother sighed, looking down at her daughter's hopeful face. She reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind Emily's ear. "Yes, sweetie, he said he would try. Let's just take it one day at a time, okay?" Emily nodded. "Okay, Mom." She leaned into her mother's side, closing her eyes. She wanted to believe that this was the beginning of something new. The next day, Emily woke up early. She got dressed, put her hair up in a ponytail, and grabbed her drawing book. She ran to the kitchen, where her mother was making breakfast. Emily pulled out a chair and sat down, flipping open her drawing book. "Mom, do you think I should draw something for Dad?" she asked, her voice full of excitement. Her mother looked over her shoulder, seeing Emily already working on something with her colored pencil. She smiled softly, though a hint of worry lingered in her eyes. "Sure, Emily, if you think it's something he'd like," she said. Emily nodded vigorously. "I'm gonna draw our family, me, you, and him. Together." She looked at her mother, a hopeful smile on her face. Her mother's heart ached a bit at her daughter's optimism. She didn't want to crush that hope, but she knew it was risky. Still, she smiled and nodded. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart." Emily spent the morning drawing, her small hands working diligently on the paper. She colored in her own image first, then her mother's, and finally her father's. She paused as she drew his face. It was hard. She didn't know him well enough to get all the details right, but she remembered his dark hair, his tall figure. She did her best, her small tongue sticking out a bit as she concentrated. By the time she was done, her mother was washing the breakfast dishes, and Emily held up the picture. "Look, Mom, what do you think?" Her mother dried her hands and turned, looking at the drawing. She smiled, her heart tightening at the sight. Emily had drawn them all together, holding hands, a big sun shining down on them. It was simple, but it carried so much hope. "It's beautiful, Emily," her mother said. She knelt down, giving her daughter a hug. "I'm sure your dad will love it." Emily beamed, carefully folding the picture and tucking it into her backpack. "I'm gonna give it to him when he comes over." Her mother nodded, giving her a gentle smile. "Okay, sweetheart. We'll see." The day moved slowly for Emily. She kept looking at her backpack, making sure the drawing was still there. Every time the phone rang, her heart skipped a beat, hoping it was her dad calling. She even practiced what she would say to him when he came over. She wanted it to be perfect. Finally, in the early evening, the phone rang. Emily's mother answered, her voice calm. Emily watched from the other room, her fingers crossed. She saw her mother's face shift, her expression softening. She nodded a few times, then looked over at Emily. "It's your dad," she said, covering the phone with her hand. "He wants to come by tomorrow. What do you think?" Emily jumped up, her eyes wide. Yes, yes, tell him to come. Her mother smiled, though her eyes were still wary. She spoke into the phone again. Okay, John. Tomorrow? Around 3. Don't be late. She hung up, looking at Emily. He's coming, sweetie. Emily let out a little cheer, running to her mother and hugging her tightly. He's really coming, Mom. Her mother hugged her back, a smile on her face, though the worry never fully left her eyes. Yes, he's really coming. The next day, Emily woke up even earlier. She got dressed in her best outfit, the one her mother had saved for special occasions. She even put a small clip in her hair. She wanted to look perfect for when her dad arrived. The day seemed to stretch forever. Emily kept looking at the clock, watching the hands move slowly. Her mother kept busy, cleaning the small apartment, making sure everything was just right. It was a mixture of excitement and tension. Emily couldn't sit still, and her mother couldn't stop worrying. Finally, the clock struck 3. Emily ran to the window, peeking out to see if her father was there. Minutes passed, and she felt her stomach twist a bit. What if he didn't come? What if he changed his mind? But then, she saw him, a tall figure walking towards the building. He looked different from the day before, more nervous. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She turned to her mother. He's here, Mom. He's here. Her mother nodded, taking a deep breath. She walked to the door, opening it just as John knocked. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking slightly unsure of himself. Hey, he said, his eyes meeting Emily's first, then her mother's. I'm here. Emily smiled, rushing forward and wrapping her arms around his waist. John hesitated, then slowly hugged her back. It felt strange but also right in a way he couldn't quite describe. Hi, Dad, Emily said, her voice muffled against his coat. Hi, Emily, he replied, his voice soft. He looked up at her mother, who was watching them carefully. Thanks for letting me come. Her mother nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Come in. We're glad you came. John stepped inside, looking around the small apartment. It was warm, lived in. He could see the effort Emily's mother had put into making it a home. Emily tugged on his hand, leading him to the small couch. I have something for you, she said, her eyes bright. She grabbed her backpack, pulling out the folded drawing. She handed it to him, her smile hopeful. John unfolded the paper, his eyes softening as he looked at the drawing. He saw the 3 of them holding hands, smiling under the sun. He swallowed, feeling his chest tighten. It's beautiful, Emily, he said, his voice thick. He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. Thank you, Emily beamed, her heart swelling with joy. She had her father there, in her home, holding her drawing. It was a small step, but to her, it felt like the start of something big. John sat on the small couch, feeling like a stranger in this cozy, unfamiliar space. He glanced around, taking in the pictures on the wall, the school projects pinned to the refrigerator, and the small shelf full of books and crayons. Everything here was new to him, but it was also Emily's world, a world he hadn't been a part of. It was a strange, heavy feeling, realizing all he had missed, but there was no going back. He knew he could only focus on what he could do now. Emily sat beside him, her legs crossed, watching him closely. Her eyes were filled with curiosity, as if she were trying to learn everything about him in a single glance. Her mother stood a little distance away, leaning against the kitchen counter, her arms crossed, her face still guarded. John could feel the weight of her gaze. He knew this was a test to see if he would stay or run away again. Emily broke the silence. Do you like the drawing, Dad? She asked, her voice full of hope. John smiled, looking back at her. I love it, Emily. It's really good. I think you're a great artist. Emily's eyes lit up, and she blushed a little. Really? I like drawing a lot. Mom says I get better every time. John nodded, and a pang of regret twisted inside him. He should have been there to see her progress, to encourage her. He looked over at Emily's mother, who met his gaze, her expression softening just a bit. He knew he couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could make things different moving forward. Emily reached for a photo album on the coffee table, opening it up and showing John pictures. Look, this is me when I was a baby, she said, pointing to a picture of herself as a chubby infant wrapped in a pink blanket. John looked at the picture, his chest tightening. He remembered the day she was born, how small and fragile she was. He'd held her in his arms, promising to protect her, to be a good father. He had broken that promise, and it hurt to see how much of her life he had missed. You were so little, John said, his voice almost a whisper. He looked at Emily. "You were beautiful then, and you're even more beautiful now." Emily smiled at his words, flipping through the pages. She showed him pictures of her first birthday, her first day of school, and a Christmas where she was surrounded by gifts. John nodded, his heart heavy as he tried to imagine the moments behind each picture. "Mom always took lots of pictures," Emily said, looking over at her mother. "She said it was important to remember the good times." Emily's mother smiled faintly, her eyes meeting John's for a moment. "I wanted Emily to have memories to hold on to. Even if," she paused, her voice trailing off. She looked at Emily and smiled again. "I wanted her to see how much she was loved." John felt a lump in his throat. He knew she meant that despite his absence, she had tried to give Emily all the love she needed. He cleared his throat, trying to speak past the tightness. "You did a great job," he said, looking at her. "You really did." Emily's mother didn't respond, but her expression softened. She pushed away from the counter, moving closer to the living room. She sat down in the armchair across from John and Emily. "So, John, what are you planning now?" she asked, her tone still carrying that edge of skepticism. John hesitated. He looked at Emily, who was watching him intently, waiting for his answer. He knew he couldn't make promises he couldn't keep. He'd done that before, and it had only hurt them more. He took a deep breath. "I don't have all the answers," he said, his eyes meeting Emily's mother's. "I'm not going to pretend I know how to do this, but I do know that I want to be here. I want to be part of Emily's life, if you'll let me." Emily smiled, her eyes bright. "I want you to be here too, Dad." Her mother looked at John, her eyes searching his face. "You understand that this isn't just about visiting once in a while, right?" she said, her voice serious. "Emily needs consistency. She needs to know that you're not going to disappear again." John nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know, I understand. I want to be here, not just today, but for good. I know I have a lot to make up for, and I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do the work." Emily's mother sighed, her eyes softening as she looked at Emily. She nodded slowly. "All right, we'll take it one step at a time." Emily beamed, her eyes flicking between her parents. She leaned into John's side, resting her head on his arm. John looked down at her, feeling something swell inside him, something that felt like hope. "Can you stay for dinner, Dad?" Emily asked, her eyes looking up at him. John hesitated, glancing at Emily's mother. She met his gaze, then gave a small nod. "If you want to stay, we can make it work." John smiled. "I'd love to, thank you." Emily jumped up, excited. "I'll help make dinner, Mom. We can make pasta." She ran to the kitchen, grabbing her small apron from the hook on the wall. John watched her, his heart swelling. He looked at her mother, who was watching Emily with a soft smile. She turned back to John, her eyes still cautious but less cold. "You should help her," she said, nodding towards the kitchen. "She loves cooking." John nodded, standing up and moving to the kitchen. Emily looked up at him, her smile wide. "Do you know how to make pasta, Dad?" John chuckled, shaking his head. "Not really. You're going to have to teach me." Emily giggled, grabbing a spoon and handing it to him. "Okay, you can stir the sauce. It's easy." John took the spoon, watching as Emily showed him how to stir, how to add the spices. She was patient, explaining everything as if she were the expert. He couldn't help but smile at her confidence. He listened, trying to memorize every detail. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Emily's mother watched them from the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression softening as she saw John and Emily working together. It was awkward, a little messy, but there was something genuine about it. She could see that John was trying, really trying, and that meant something. Dinner was simple, but to Emily, it felt like a celebration. They sat at the small table, John at one end, her mother at the other, and Emily in between. She talked excitedly about school, her friends, and the art project she was working on. John listened, nodding, asking questions, trying to be present. After dinner, they sat in the living room, Emily showing John more of her drawings. She talked about her favorite books, her favorite stories, and John listened, genuinely interested. He could see her mother watching him, her eyes cautious but hopeful. He knew he had a long way to go, that it wouldn't be easy to earn back their trust. But for now, he was here, and that was a start. As the evening wound down, Emily's mother spoke up. "It's getting late, Emily. Time to get ready for bed." Emily pouted a little but nodded. She looked at John, her eyes wide. "Will you come back soon, Dad?" John smiled, leaning down to hug her. "Of course, I'll be back soon, I promise." Emily hugged him tightly, then ran off to get ready for bed. John stood up, turning to her mother. "Thank you for letting me come. It means a lot." Her mother nodded. "Just keep your promises, John. That's all we ask." John nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I will. I won't let her down again." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll see." John walked to the door, glancing back at Emily, who was waving from the hallway. He waved back, then stepped outside, closing the door behind him. As he walked away, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of something he wanted to fight for. The next day came quickly, and Emily couldn't stop talking about her dad. She woke up with a renewed energy, her excitement bursting through every word and every action. Her mom noticed the change, how Emily seemed to skip through her morning routine, her face bright with a smile that hadn't been there in a long time. It made her mother's heart swell with hope. Even as she tried to temper her expectations, she wanted to believe that John would keep his word, that he wouldn't let Emily down again. Emily had her backpack ready, her drawing book inside. She hugged her mother before leaving for school, her small voice filled with excitement. "Do you think Dad will come soon, Mom?" she asked. Her mother smiled, brushing Emily's hair back gently. "I think he will, sweetie. But remember, we're taking it one day at a time, right?" Emily nodded, though her smile didn't fade. "One day at a time," she repeated, and with that, she ran out the door, waving at her mom as she went. Emily's mother sighed as she watched her go. She turned back to the small apartment, her eyes landing on the spot where John had sat the night before. She hoped more than anything that he was serious this time. Later that morning, John stood in his office, staring at his phone. He had promised Emily he'd call, and it was time to keep that promise. But even as he reached for the phone, doubt gnawed at him. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to letting people in, especially not after he'd made so many mistakes. He took a deep breath, dialing the number Emily had given him. The line rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Emily's mother said, her voice cautious. "Hey, it's John," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I was just calling to see if I could, see Emily again. Maybe this weekend." There was a pause, and John could feel the hesitation on the other end. Finally, she spoke, her tone serious. "John, you know how much this means to her. If you say you're coming, you need to be here. No excuses." John nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I understand. I won't let her down. I promise." Another pause, then a sigh. "Okay, this weekend, then, we'll be here." John smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. "Thank you. I appreciate it." They ended the call, and John looked at the phone for a moment. He had made a promise, and this time, he intended to keep it. The rest of the week passed with Emily counting down the days. She talked about her dad to anyone who would listen. Her teacher, her friends at school, even the crossing guard. She was proud, and she wanted everyone to know that her dad was coming to see her. When Saturday finally arrived, Emily woke up early, getting dressed in her favorite outfit. She even brushed her hair twice, making sure everything was just right. Her mother watched her from the doorway, a soft smile on her face. "Excited, huh?" her mom asked. Emily turned, her eyes bright. "Yes, I can't wait for Dad to get here." Her mother nodded, kneeling down and adjusting Emily's collar. "Okay, sweetheart, just remember, we're taking it slow, right?" Emily nodded, though her excitement was palpable. She could barely stand still as she waited. 3 o'clock came, and Emily was already by the window, watching for any sign of her dad. She saw cars pulling in and out of the parking lot, but none of them were his. She bit her lip, glancing back at her mom, who was in the kitchen making tea. "Do you think he's coming?" Emily asked, her voice a bit more unsure now. Her mother looked up, her heart aching at the worry in her daughter's eyes. "I'm sure he's on his way, sweetie. Sometimes people just run a little late." Emily nodded, though her eyes were still glued to the window. She watched as another car pulled up, and this time, she recognized the tall figure stepping out. Her heart leapt, and she turned, her voice full of excitement. "He's here, Mom! He's here!" Her mother smiled, setting the tea aside. "All right, let's go let him in." Emily ran to the door, flinging it open just as John reached the top of the stairs. He smiled down at her, his face softening at the sight of her excitement. "Hey, kiddo," he said, bending down to hug her. Emily wrapped her arms around him tightly. "You came. I knew you'd come." John hugged her back, his heart swelling. He looked up at Emily's mother, who stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of relief and caution. He gave her a nod. "Thank you for letting me come," she nodded back, stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in. We were just about to have some tea." John stepped inside, looking around the small apartment again. It was cozy, and there was something warm about it, something that made him feel like he was a part of something, even if just a little. Emily tugged on his hand, leading him to the couch. "I want to show you more of my drawings, Dad. I made some new ones," John smiled, sitting down beside her. "I'd love to see them." Emily grabbed her drawing book, flipping it open and showing him the new pictures she had made. John watched her, his heart tightening as she pointed out each one, explaining them with so much enthusiasm. He couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if he'd been around all this time. But he pushed those thoughts aside. He was here now, and that was what mattered. Emily's mother brought over a tray with tea and some cookies. She sat down in the armchair, watching as John and Emily talked. She could see the effort John was making, how he was really trying to connect with Emily. It was awkward, and there were moments when it felt forced, but he was trying, and that meant something. As they sat there, the afternoon slowly turned into evening. Emily kept talking, her excitement never fading. She showed John her favorite book, read him a few pages, and even got him to help her draw a picture. John did his best, though his drawings were clumsy compared to hers. Emily laughed, showing him how to draw the way she did. At one point, Emily's mother looked at John, her voice softer now. "Emily's always loved art. She draws every day. It's her favorite thing to do." John nodded, looking at his daughter. "I can tell. She's really talented." Emily beamed at the praise, her eyes bright. "Maybe one day I'll be an artist, like the ones in the books." John smiled. "I think you can be anything you want, Emily." Emily's mother watched them, her heart softening at the sight. She could see that John meant it, that he was really trying to be there for Emily. And maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. As the evening grew later, Emily's mother spoke up. "It's getting late, and Emily needs to get ready for bed soon." Emily looked up at John, her face falling slightly. "Do you have to go, Dad?" John nodded, though he hated to see the disappointment on her face. "Yeah, I should get going, but I'll be back, okay? I promise." Emily nodded, her eyes brightening again. "Okay, you'll come back soon, right?" John smiled, reaching out to hug her. "Very soon, kiddo. I promise." Emily hugged him tightly, then stepped back, watching as he stood up. John looked at Emily's mother, giving her a nod. "Thank you again. I really appreciate it." She nodded, her expression softer now. "Just keep showing up, John. That's all we ask." John nodded. He walked to the door, glancing back at Emily. She waved at him, her eyes full of hope. He waved back, then stepped outside, closing the door behind him. As he walked away, he felt lighter. He knew there was a long way to go, and that it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. He was taking it one step at a time, and for now, that was enough. John showed up at Emily's apartment again the next weekend. This time, he wasn't as nervous. He had felt something during his last visit, something that made all the awkwardness worth it. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready. He had to be ready. Emily deserved that. He stood at the door, knocking lightly. He could already hear the hurried steps from inside, followed by the excited voice of Emily. "He's here, Mom! Dad's here!" The door swung open, and there she was, her bright smile lighting up the whole room. "Hey, kiddo," John said, bending down to give her a hug. She threw her arms around him, and he could feel the warmth of her small frame. It filled him with a kind of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. Emily pulled back, her eyes shining. "I made something for you," she said, her voice full of excitement. She grabbed his hand, tugging him into the apartment. Emily's mother stood by the table, a gentle smile on her face. "Welcome back, John," she said, her tone softer now. "Emily's been waiting for you all day." John smiled at her. "Thank you for having me back." He let Emily lead him to the table, where a piece of paper lay flat. It was another drawing, but this one was different. It was a picture of the three of them: Emily, her mother, and him. They were all standing together, holding hands, with big smiles drawn across their faces. Emily beamed, pointing to each figure. "See? This is you, Dad, and that's me, and that's Mom. I drew us all together." John's throat tightened. He stared at the drawing, his eyes lingering on the three smiling faces. He felt something stir deep inside, an ache that he couldn't quite describe. He looked up at Emily, her eyes so full of hope. "It's beautiful, Emily," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Thank you. I love it." He reached out, pulling her into another hug. He held her tightly, feeling the promise in her drawing, a promise of a family he hadn't known he wanted until now. Emily's mother watched from the other side of the room. She could see how much this meant to Emily, and she could see John trying. It was awkward, it was imperfect, but it was genuine. She cleared her throat, her voice breaking the moment. "Why don't we put that drawing on the fridge, Emily, so we can see it every day?" Emily pulled away from John, her face lighting up. "Yes, that's a great idea, Mom." She grabbed a magnet from the fridge and pressed the drawing against the door, carefully smoothing it out. John watched her, a smile tugging at his lips. He glanced at Emily's mother, their eyes meeting for a moment. There was something different in her gaze this time, something softer, less guarded. She nodded towards the couch. "Why don't we sit down? I made some tea." They moved to the small living room, the familiar tea set already waiting on the coffee table. Emily sat next to John, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. Emily's mother poured the tea, handing a cup to John, and then one to Emily. "So, what's the plan for today, Dad?" Emily asked, her eyes wide and curious. John chuckled, taking a sip of his tea. He hadn't planned anything specific. He just wanted to be here, to spend time with Emily, but he didn't want to disappoint her. "Well, I was thinking maybe you could show me your favorite book, and we could read it together. How does that sound?" Emily's eyes brightened, and she nodded eagerly. "Yes, I have the perfect one." She jumped up, running to her room to grab the book. As soon as she was gone, Emily's mother turned to John. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "You're really trying, aren't you?" John looked at her, his face serious. "Yeah, I am. I know it's going to take time, but I want to be here. For her. And for you too. I know I messed up before, but I'm not going to run away again." Emily's mother studied him for a moment, then nodded. "She believes in you. Just don't let her down." John swallowed hard, the weight of her words hitting him. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I won't," he said. Emily came running back, her favorite book clutched in her hands. She hopped back onto the couch, snuggling in close to John. "This one, Dad. It's about a girl who goes on adventures with her dad." John smiled, taking the book from her hands. He opened it, his voice softening as he began to read. Emily leaned against him, her small fingers playing with the hem of his sleeve as she listened. Her mother watched from the other side of the room, sipping her tea, her eyes softening as she watched them together. The story moved slowly, John's voice filling the small room. He paused occasionally to answer Emily's questions, to explain a word she didn't understand. They laughed at the funny parts, and Emily gasped at the exciting moments. It felt so normal, so simple, but it meant everything to John. He realized, as he read, that this was what he had missed. These small moments of connection, of being there, of sharing something real. When they finished the book, Emily clapped her hands together, her face beaming. "That was so good. I love this story." John smiled, setting the book aside. "I loved it too, Emily. Thanks for sharing it with me." Emily looked up at him, her eyes full of hope. Do you think we could go on an adventure too, Dad? Like in the story?" John blinked, taken aback. He looked at her, then at her mother, who was watching carefully. He swallowed, nodding slowly. "Yeah, Emily, I think we could. Maybe not right away, but we could plan something, just the two of us." Emily's face lit up, and she hugged him tightly. "That would be amazing, Dad! I can't wait!" John held her, his heart full. He glanced at her mother, who gave him a small nod, her expression softer now. He knew he still had a long way to go, but this was a start. He could be the father Emily needed, one small step at a time. As the evening went on, they stayed together in the small living room. They talked, laughed, and shared stories. Emily's mother joined in too, her guardedness slowly fading. She watched John interact with Emily, and she could see the change. He was trying, really trying, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. As bedtime approached, Emily's mother looked at the clock. "All right, Emily, it's time to start getting ready for bed." Emily pouted, looking at John. "Do you have to go, Dad?" John smiled, ruffling her hair. "Yeah, kiddo, I should go, but I'll be back soon. And remember, We've got that adventure to plan. Emily nodded, her face lighting up again. Okay, I'll start making a list of all the places we should go. John chuckled. That sounds like a great idea. He stood up, looking at Emily's mother. Thank you again for letting me be here. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. Just keep your promises, John. That's all we need. John nodded, turning back to Emily. He knelt down, pulling her into a hug. Good night, Emily. I'll see you soon, okay? Emily hugged him tightly. Good night, Dad. I love you. John's breath caught in his throat. He held her for a moment longer, then pulled back, his eyes misty. I love you too, Emily. More than anything. Emily smiled, waving as he walked to the door. He looked back at them one last time, then stepped outside, the door closing behind him. As he walked away, he felt a strange mixture of emotions, hope, fear, but mostly determination. He was going to do this. He was going to be there for Emily, to keep showing up, to keep building this new promise, one small step at a time. The following week felt different for John. It was as if something had shifted in him, and it showed in the way he handled his daily life. He was no longer just going through the motions. He found himself thinking about Emily constantly, about her drawings, her smile, her excitement about their next adventure. He even started adjusting his work schedule, something he had never thought he would do for anyone. For Emily, he wanted to make time. It was Wednesday afternoon when he finally had a moment to himself in his office. He picked up his phone and stared at the screen. He had promised Emily he would keep in touch. He knew a message could mean the world to her. And it was such a simple thing. Taking a deep breath, he typed a short message. Hey, Emily. Just wanted to say hi and see how your day is going. Hope you're having fun at school. He hit send and set the phone down, a small smile tugging at his lips. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. He tried to focus on his work after that, but he kept glancing at his phone, waiting. Finally, it buzzed, and he picked it up quickly. It was Emily. Hi, Dad. I just got out of school. It was fun. We had art today, and I drew another picture for you. I can't wait to show you. John's smile widened. He replied, That sounds great, kiddo. I can't wait to see it. Keep drawing. You're amazing at it. There was something so pure in these messages, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. It was connection. A small, simple connection, but it meant everything to him now. Saturday came quickly, and John found himself once again at the door of Emily's apartment. He knocked, and as expected, Emily's excited footsteps came running to the door. She opened it with a big smile, her eyes lighting up at the sight of him. Dad, she exclaimed, throwing her arms around his waist. John hugged her back, his heart swelling at her warmth. Every time he saw her, it felt a little less awkward, a little more natural. He was getting used to it, being a dad. Emily's mother appeared, her face softening at the sight of them. Hello, John. Come in. John stepped inside, looking around. There were more of Emily's drawings pinned up now. He recognized the one she had mentioned in her message, a drawing of a big tree with 3 figures underneath, all of them smiling. It made his heart swell with pride. He smiled at Emily. You've been busy drawing, haven't you? Emily nodded eagerly. I wanted to make more for you. I drew this one because I thought maybe we could have a picnic one day, under a big tree. What do you think? John looked at her, his chest tightening at her words. A picnic, such a simple thing, but something he had never imagined before. I think that sounds perfect, Emily, he said, his voice soft. We'll make it happen. Emily grinned, bouncing on her feet. Really? That would be so much fun. Her mother smiled, stepping into the kitchen. I made some cookies, if you're hungry. Emily helped. John followed them into the kitchen, sitting at the small table while Emily's mother brought over a plate of freshly baked cookies. Emily sat beside him, her eyes bright with excitement. I put extra chocolate chips in them. I hope you like it. John picked one up, taking a bite. It was warm, sweet, and filled with chocolate. He smiled at Emily. This is amazing, Emily. You're a great baker. Emily giggled, her face lighting up with pride. Thanks, Dad. They spent the afternoon together, the small apartment feeling cozy and full. Emily showed him her drawings, read another story to him, and even tried to teach him how to draw a dog. John's attempt ended up looking more like a blob with ears, and Emily laughed, her laughter echoing through the room. It was a sound John wished he could hear every day. Later, as evening started to fall, Emily's mother looked at the clock. It's getting late, Emily. Time to start getting ready for bed. Emily pouted, looking up at John. Can Dad stay a little longer? John smiled, ruffling her hair. I wish I could, kiddo, but I have to go. But I'll be back soon, okay? And we'll plan that picnic, remember? Emily nodded, her eyes still hopeful. Okay, you promise? John knelt down, looking her in the eyes. I promise, Emily. I'm not going anywhere. She smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck and hugging him tightly. John held her close, his heart swelling. He kissed the top of her head, then stood up, looking at Emily's mother. Thank you again for letting me be here, he said, his voice sincere. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. You're doing well, John. Just keep it up. John smiled, the words filling him with a sense of pride. He was trying, and it seemed like it was enough, for now. He turned back to Emily, waving as he stepped out the door. She waved back, her eyes still full of hope. The following week, John found himself adjusting his work schedule even more. He spoke with his assistant, asking to rearrange a few meetings so he could have more time on the weekends. It wasn't something he had ever considered before, but now, it was a priority. His assistant raised an eyebrow, a curious smile on her face. You seem different, John. Everything all right? John smiled, nodding. Yeah, actually. Everything's better than all right. He sent Emily another message that afternoon, just to check in. She responded quickly, telling him all about her day at school, about how she had aced a spelling test and was excited to tell him about it. It was simple, but it was real. It was what he had been missing all these years. Saturday rolled around again, and John showed up right on time. Emily's face lit up when she opened the door, her small arms wrapping around him instantly. Hey, kiddo, John said, hugging her back. Ready for that picnic? Emily pulled back, her eyes wide with excitement. We're really doing it. Today? John nodded, smiling. Yep, I brought some sandwiches, and I know just the place. Emily turned to her mother, her eyes pleading. Mom, can we go? Please. Emily's mother smiled, nodding. Of course. Let's get ready. They packed a small basket with sandwiches, fruit, and some of Emily's favorite cookies. Emily grabbed her drawing book, insisting she wanted to draw while they were there. They made their way to a nearby park, a large tree standing tall in the center. John spread out a blanket under the tree, and they all sat down together. The day was perfect. The sun shone down through the branches, the light dappling the ground around them. Emily talked and laughed, drawing pictures of the tree, of her parents, of the sandwiches they ate. John watched her, his heart full. He looked at Emily's mother, who was watching him in return. She gave him a small nod, her expression softer than he had ever seen. You're doing well, John, she said quietly, her voice carrying warmth. Thank you for being here. John nodded, his eyes meeting hers. Thank you for letting me. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm not going anywhere. I promise. Emily looked up from her drawing, her eyes bright. Can we do this every week, Dad? I love it. John smiled, reaching out and taking her small hand in his. Yeah, kiddo. We can do this as much as you want. Emily grinned, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. They weren't just a broken family trying to pick up the pieces. They were building something new, something better. One small step at a time, they were becoming a family again. The sun was setting as John, Emily, and her mother returned to the apartment from their picnic. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and Emily held onto John's hand as they walked. She was tired but happy, her little legs trying to keep up with her parents. She looked up at them, her face flushed with excitement from the day. For her, it had been one of the best days she could remember. When they reached the building, Emily ran ahead, reaching the door and waiting for John and her mother to catch up. She was practically bouncing in place, still full of the energy from everything they'd done. John exchanged a look with Emily's mother, and they both smiled. They were sharing a moment, one of those moments that felt ordinary, but also so significant. Emily's mother unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The warmth of the apartment enveloped them, and it felt different now, less like a place John was visiting and more like a home. Emily immediately ran to the small couch and pulled out her drawing book. Dad, I want to show you the drawing I did of our picnic today, she said, already flipping through the pages to find it. John set the picnic basket down and walked over to Emily, sitting beside her. She held the book up to him, showing a new drawing of 3 figures sitting under a tree. Emily in the middle, holding her parents' hands. They all had wide smiles, and the sun was shining bright above them. John swallowed, his heart tightening. That's beautiful, Emily. You're getting better and better every time. Emily's mother smiled, coming over with a cup of juice for Emily. She looked at the drawing, her own heart swelling with emotion. You captured everything perfectly, sweetheart. It was a wonderful day. Emily took the juice and nodded, her eyes bright. It really was. She looked up at John, her expression softening. You're not going to leave again, right, Dad? John's heart clenched. He looked at her, his throat tightening. He took a deep breath, wrapping his arm around her small shoulders. No, kiddo. I'm not going anywhere. I promise. I want to be here. Always. Emily smiled, leaning into his side. I'm glad. I love you, Dad. John's eyes stung with unshed tears, and he hugged her close. I love you too, Emily. More than anything. Emily's mother watched them, her eyes misty as well. She sat down in the armchair across from them, her voice quiet. We've come a long way, haven't we? John nodded, his eyes meeting hers. Yeah, we really have. There was a moment of silence, a comfortable silence that was filled with understanding. It was as if, in that one look, they both knew that this was a new beginning. It wouldn't be perfect. There would still be challenges, bumps in the road. But it was real. It was a family, and it was worth fighting for. Do you think we can do more adventures? Emily asked, her eyes still hopeful. John smiled, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. Absolutely, kiddo. As many adventures as you want. We'll go on all of them together. Emily beamed, her face lighting up. We could even go camping, or go to the beach, or maybe even the zoo. She rattled off her ideas, her excitement infectious. John laughed, nodding. I think all of those sound like great ideas. We'll make a list, and we'll do every single one. Emily's mother smiled, her heart feeling lighter. She looked at John, her voice soft. Thank you, John. Thank you for being here, for trying. John looked at her, his expression earnest. Thank you for giving me a chance. I know I've made a lot of mistakes, but I'm here now, and I'm going to keep showing up. She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. That's all we need. They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing stories, and laughing. The apartment felt full of warmth, of laughter, of hope. Emily showed John more of her drawings, her little voice carrying through the room as she explained each one. John listened intently, soaking in every detail, every moment. It was the kind of normalcy he had never realized he needed. As it grew late, Emily's mother finally spoke up. All right, sweetheart. It's time to start getting ready for bed. Emily pouted a little but nodded. Okay, Mom. She turned to John, her eyes wide. Will you tuck me in, Dad? John blinked, caught off guard. He nodded quickly, his heart swelling. Of course, Emily. I'd love to. Emily grinned, grabbing his hand and pulling him towards her room. She led him to her small bed, crawling under the covers and looking up at him expectantly. John sat on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair back gently. Did you have a good day today? He asked softly. Emily nodded, her eyes sleepy but full of joy. The best day ever. I'm so happy you're here, Dad. John's throat tightened. He leaned down, kissing her forehead. I'm happy I'm here too. Emily, sweet dreams. Okay, I'll see you in the morning. Emily smiled, her eyes closing. Good night, Dad. I love you. John watched her for a moment, his heart full. I love you too, Emily. He stood up, turning off the small lamp beside her bed and walking back to the living room. Emily's mother was cleaning up, putting away the last of the dishes. She looked up as John approached, giving him a small smile. She really loves you, you know, she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. John nodded, his eyes misty. I love her too. I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure she knows that. Emily's mother studied him for a moment, then nodded. I believe you. She paused, then added, You know, you're welcome here, anytime. You're part of this family now, John. John's breath caught in his throat. He looked at her, his chest tightening. It was what he had wanted to hear, but he hadn't expected it. He nodded, his voice thick. Thank you. That means everything to me. She smiled, wiping her hands on a towel and walking over to him. We'll take it one day at a time. No rush, no pressure, just being here together. John nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. It was simple, but it was everything he needed. One day at a time, he repeated. They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around them. It was the kind of quiet that felt full, not of emptiness, but of promise. They had a long road ahead of them, but they were on it together, and that was enough. John finally said his goodbyes and stepped out into the hallway, closing the door gently behind him. He looked back at the door for a moment, taking in the feeling of leaving not just an apartment, but a home. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a place where he truly belonged. He turned, walking down the stairs, his heart lighter than it had ever been. Emily's face, her laughter, the warmth of her hug, all of it replayed in his mind as he walked. He knew there would be challenges, moments of doubt, and times when he would have to face his past mistakes, but he was ready for it. He was ready to be the father that Emily deserved. And as he stepped out into the cool night air, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for a future where he was present, where he was part of something bigger than himself. A family, one small step at a time. He was building that future. One day at a time, he was learning how to be the dad Emily needed. And for now, that was more than enough.